Deirdre, today is the day the U.S. government hits its $14.3 trillion debt ceiling, and with no agreement in sight on raising that limit, America is edging toward the unthinkable, a default on the federal debt. For more, we welcome Jay Powell. Jay is a former Treasury Undersecretary for Finance under President George H.W. Bush and a former managing director of the Carlyle Group. He's currently a visiting scholar at the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, where he specializes in fiscal issues. Jay, welcome to the show. I just said that a default on the federal debt is unthinkable, but is it really unthinkable? The Wall Street Journal, at the very least, has been making the case that a tactical default on the debt isn't such a bad idea, and it's started to label people who oppose that notion the Armageddon lobby.
Well, Congress has to raise the debt limit, and therefore Congress will raise the debt limit, and there will not be a default on our debt. Those are my predictions, and I feel reasonably confident of that. And as we can get into, I think it's quite unfortunate that the Wall Street Journal editorial page is pushing the idea regularly now that it would be okay to have a sort of a technical short-term default that the market would overlook.
Now, why do you say unfortunate? You know, this is a very lively debate, and I know that you're a self-described fiscal conservative, so perhaps, you might think that any ammunition that could be brought to bear to force some kind of an agreement and some concessions to be made on the part of the administration would be a good thing. And isn't the Journal advancing that case in some way?
Yes, I am by any fair reckoning a fiscal conservative. This is really a question of tactics, not a question of whether the goal itself is desirable. The risks, the overwhelming majority of experts, market participants, current and former Treasury and Fed officials of both parties would say that the idea of even a very short technical default, failure to pay interest, even for a matter of days, on the part of the United States government would be a completely unacceptable risk to run. That the downside of that risk, it's never happened in the history of our country, and the downside is unbounded, potentially enormous. And it's just not a risk that you run. That doesn't mean that you don't negotiate very hard to get additional spending cuts and get the deficit under control. You do, but that crosses the line into hostage taking, I'm afraid, and is just tactically unacceptable.
Okay, tactically unacceptable to you, but apparently acceptable to the likes of Stan Druckenmiller, the former associate of George Soros. He ran his own firm, Duquesne Capital. The Wall Street Journal marshaled his comments to bear in the debate over the weekend in an interview where they quoted him as saying, "I don't think it's going to be the end of the world. It's not going to be catastrophic." Now, granted, Stan Druckenmiller wasn't talking about a permanent moratorium on interest in principle, only a period of a few days. I take it you disagree even with the notion of a few days of missed interest payments.
There are a small handful of people, and some of them are highly respected, like Stanley Druckenmiller. Very few of them would have that kind of stature, but who believe that we could get away with this. As I mentioned, the overwhelming majority of market participants, everybody else feels like you just can't do this. I mean, the possibility, the scheme is that we would intentionally default on our debt, that the world investing community would go, oh, that's just a technical default, no problem there. Wait patiently while we negotiate a budget deal that Democrats, who would be presumably opposed to these kind of deep entitlement cuts that Stanley Druckenmiller wants, would cave because of the threat to the United States, and that we would then enact a budget reduction package, and the market would look at it and go, oh yeah, that works for us. We're glad we stayed in this. Now, there's so many ways to lose that bet. If all of those things don't fall into place, you could have a situation where, for example, foreign investors leave and don't come back, as they did when the housing GSEs went into conservatorship in 2008. They left and they haven't come back, and they may not come back for quite a while. So the downside risk is permanent damage to our role as the world's leading, really only reserve currency at this time. Higher interest rates, shock to the bond market, shock to the equity market, shock to the economy. And just the kind of genie you can't get back into the bottle. And, I think nothing about this fact pattern says to me, let's take the word of Stanley Druckenmiller, brilliant and successful though he may be, and ignore, the other vast preponderance of experts who say it's just not a risk that you take.
Do you think there are elements in the Republican Party in Congress right now, Jay, that are willing to test this conventional wisdom? Or are they listening to their constituents. There was a poll that came out, Politico published it this morning. It was a battleground poll that said 56% of Americans, I think they polled 1,000 people, would consider the consequences of a debt default disastrous.
You know, you won't know till you find out. But I do think in the end, I do believe in the end that Congress will find the votes to raise the debt limit because it has to. And I think ultimately, the Wall Street Journal is not helping with their campaign, but ultimately, cooler heads will prevail. I think clearly the leadership on the Hill does not agree that it's okay to default on the debt, even temporarily on purpose. So I think there may be those who are never going to accept that position or don't want to accept that position. You know, let's face it, the real problem is that the debt limit vote is a very, very hard vote for Democrats and Republicans. No one wants to vote to raise the debt limit. The public doesn't really understand what it is. And so for that reason, it'll pass with significant budget savings and enforcement mechanisms attached. But ultimately, it will pass. I simply don't believe in the end that we will default on our debt.
Jay, thanks for joining us. A prediction from Jay Powell, former undersecretary of the Treasury. We will pass a bill to raise the debt ceiling, rather. We will not default. He says that is a genie you simply cannot afford to try and put back in the bottle.